The cynical and shameful politicization of the persecution of Christians, Donald Trump's endorsement of Mark Carney, and why Mark Carney's trans activist daughter is important, and despite what progressive journalists say, we should cover that story. That's what we'll be covering on today's episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. Our first story today is about the cynical politicization of the persecution of Christians around the world, which has attracted the world's scattered focus for the first time in quite a while because of the gruesome beheading of 70 Christians in a church in Congo after they were kidnapped by Islamist militants, and the pogroms that are ongoing in Syria right now. The death toll rose from 1,200 to 3,000, now to approximately 7,000 religious minorities have been killed again by Islamist militants in Syria. In Syria, the situation is a little bit more complicated because we're not seeing specifically just Christians being targeted. A lot of those who are being killed. In fact, right now, the biggest majority of the victims are actually of the Alawite minority. But there's an old Syrian phrase that goes, first the Alawites and then the Christians. It's important to note here that Christians are the most persecuted group on earth. And according to Open Doors, more than 380 million Christians face, quote, high levels of persecution and discrimination for their faith. That means 1 in 7 Christians worldwide is persecuted, including 1 in 5 Christians in Africa and 2 in 5 Christians in Asia. But this is something that doesn't get discussed very often. Most people would be forgiven for not knowing that Christians are the most persecuted group on earth. And that's because in Western countries, we've been going through this like half-century long struggle session to reject the foundation of our civilization, which is Christianity. In short, Christians really complicate progressive oppression narratives. They make very inconvenient victims because in the oppression hierarchies endorsed by most progressive parties, Christians are actually the villains. And so to discuss the fact that Christians are the most persecuted group on earth, as the New Testament said that it would be, this is something that most progressive politicians want to ignore. And they've gone to great lengths to avoid discussing this, and sometimes it's been really, really ridiculous. So some of you may remember back in 2019 when there was a series of bombing attacks in Sri Lanka. These were horrifying attacks. There were photos of bombs that were set in churches, went off in churches, and they went off during Easter when Christians were going to celebrate Easter. And almost every progressive politician bent into pretzels to avoid mentioning the identity of those who were targeted, despite the fact that they were targeted because of their identity. So Barack Obama's tweet was, "The attacks on tourists and Easter worshippers in Sri Lanka are an attack on humanity." Now, of course, the attacks were specifically against Christians, not against humanity in general, and not against Easter worshipers either. There was all kinds of sort of tongue-in-cheek jokes that were made after his tweet went out. Who is an Easter worshiper? Are they people who worship the great statues on Easter Island? We have a name for the people who celebrate Easter. But of course, Barack Obama didn't want to say their name because Christians are very inconvenient victims. This is something that Mary Eberstadt covered extensively in her 2016 book, It's Dangerous to Believe. But there's now another trend that's emerged lately that I think is very worth pointing out, and that is self-identified conservative commentators who are using the issue of the persecution of Christians to push their preferred ideological narratives or political hobby horses, and in some case, deliberately insidious agendas. And they kind of use this tactic to whip up support for whatever issue they currently care about by claiming, A, that the target that they dislike is persecuting Christians, and that conversely, anybody who disagrees with them supports the persecution of Christians. And this is a really potent tactic, and it's made even more potent by context-free sound bites, and then, of course, video clips that are capable of generating an enormous amount of response. Most of the videos, for example, that went viral on X about the horrifying things going on in Syria right now were actually of Alawites being murdered, persecuted, beaten, other horrifying things done to them. But most of the clips circulated on X, they were identified as Christians being persecuted. Just one example of how easy it is in social media land to kind of lose track of a vetting process that helps us determine what we're actually looking at. So I think the best example of this is Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is incredibly disingenuous in the way he makes most arguments now. If you watch the way he pivots during interviews, if you watch him make the case for his most recent ideological obsession, he almost never is willing to analyze both sides of the story. He's never willing to incorporate nuances. He invents definitions and then defends those invented definitions as if they prove his case. He used to be a really brilliant journalist. I own 2 of his books. His collection of long-form essays published at places like the Weekly Standard, brilliant stuff. So I want to emphasize here that I think Tucker Carlson is a tremendously talented journalist, which makes the stuff that he's up to lately particularly depressing. So just as an example of how he is using the issue of persecution to kind of buttress his own political preferences in the moment. He constantly refers to the Ukrainian government as having, quote, banned a Christian faith, and he always refers to the persecuted Christians of Ukraine. Now, without context, this really does seem like a damning accusation. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and I visited Ukraine 6 months later, I went to recently liberated areas and I interviewed a lot of Christians. The Orthodox Church in Ukraine severed ties with the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, for those of you who are unaware of what Orthodox politics looks like, the Moscow Patriarchate is overseen by Patriarch Kirill. He is basically Putin's right-hand man in many ways, and he has openly endorsed Putin's war. He is a political figure, not a religious figure. And one of the 3 branches of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine chose to maintain links to the Kremlin while, to be fair, formally condemning the war. But the Ukraine government believes that these Russian connections are a national security threat. I think relevant historical context here as well is the Orthodox Church has been infiltrated by the state for decades, right? The KGB almost entirely ran the Russian Orthodox Church for the duration of the existence of the Soviet Union, right up to and including actually appointing most of their clergy. And so this is not some wild outside-the-box accusation the Ukrainian government is making when they're saying that a church with connections to the Kremlin that has not broken ties with the political figure at the head of the Moscow Patriarchate right now, that this poses a national security threat, totally plausible. And so in response to this, in 2023, the government terminated a lease that allowed UOC monks to reside at the monastery caves in Kiev, and the abbot of the monastery was placed under house arrest for alleged and suspected Kremlin links. This move, just by the way, was defended publicly by many Orthodox leaders, including the Global Orthodox Public Affairs Committee. Now, it's worth noting here that 72% of Ukrainians identify as Orthodox, and that the membership of the Moscow-affiliated branch dropped from 18% to 4% after the Russian invasion. So this is context for Tucker Carlson's context-free accusations of the Ukrainian government as a persecutor of Christians and referring to the persecution of Christians, whereas what I've just explained to you here, it has nothing to do with whether or not somebody's Christian. 72% of Ukrainians identify as Orthodox, and everything to do with the fact that they're currently at war with a country that's invaded them. That's context that's completely left out. Now, I agree that the Ukrainian government's decision is worthy of scrutiny. When religious liberty is at stake, we should always be very carefully scrutinizing the actions of governments. And I think people can disagree in good faith on this issue about the moves the Ukrainian government made. But where it becomes clear that the accusations leveled by Carlson and his clones are completely ideologically driven is that they are deliberately disinterested in both context and what most Ukrainian religious leaders actually have to say about that, none of whom are ever quoted or even referenced. And Putin's Russia is conversely portrayed as staunchly Christian, and Putin's own record left totally unremarked on. And this is ridiculous, right? So on one hand, Tucker Carlson calls Zelensky, a dark figure, a rat-like figure. These are 2 things that he has said. Those are direct quotes. And then he goes to Putin's Moscow and he visits the Moscow subway. And he does this sort of PR tour where he's like, look how clean the subway is. The subway in DC is disgusting. And so when you take all these things together, he's praising a country that has no religious liberty at all. He's criticizing one without any context for the moves that have actually been made and what this persecution actually entails. And then he essentially starts to praise Putin as a very, very popular leader, a very, very good leader in many ways, when he gets pushed on specifics of the fact that, Putin's enemies have a really bad habit of shooting themselves in the back of the head or ingesting rare poisons or toppling off fifth-story balconies backwards. When confronted with those things, Carlson will say, I don't know. These are not the kinds of things I want to address. But I spent several weeks in Russia in 2018 specifically covering the relationship between the state and the church. I was with a Danish journalist, and the story we were there to investigate was this idea that there was a huge resurgence of orthodoxy in Russia. And what we found while we were there, and we interviewed so many different people we went to monasteries, we interviewed nuns, we talked to Orthodox priests, we went to different churches. And essentially what we found is that Putin views orthodoxy as a useful repository of Russian identity, but other Christian denominations pose a threat to Russian identity. And so hundreds of people have actually been charged with anti-missionary activity for proselytizing under a 2016 anti-terrorism law. Russia's Christian dissidents don't fare well either. And so to emphasize Ukraine's granted debatable position on religious liberty while organizing Russia's total absence of it is incredibly deceitful, although a very effective exercise in narrative building. And so Tucker Carlson knows that your average conservative, your average Christian listening to his show is going to react to calling somebody a persecutor of Christians very, very strongly. And so he's making these accusations because he wants to buttress his particular view on the Russia-Ukraine war. That's not a subject I'm particularly interested in discussing. These tactics, though, are disgusting. They really are disgusting, and they should be called out as such. It's not journalism. It's not honest commentary. It's not good faith discussion. And it's, I think, using the plight of Christians around the world for, frankly, insidious ends. A second example of how influencers are exploiting the persecution of Christians for their own ideological ends is the reaction to the recent pogroms in Syria. So almost immediately, anti-Israel influencers began claiming that Israel and Israelis were somehow responsible for and maybe even supportive of the atrocities in the videos that were going viral across X. Now, regardless of your view on Israel's military operation in Gaza to recover their kidnapped civilians and to punish Hamas, the allegation that Israel is an anti-Christian nation that is either apathetic to or actively endorses the persecution of Christians is, frankly, a vile echo of a very ancient blood libel. That is what is going on. These are very, very old accusations, but the idea that Israelis actually support the kinds of atrocities we see in those videos when Israel is actually a bastion of religious liberty is really, really disgusting. And so what we're seeing is people saying Christians are being persecuted. How can I use that to inform the narrative I'm already pushing? How can I pin the persecution of Christian on the Jews or on the Ukrainians? How can I make sure that the people that I currently have contempt for bear the blame for the horrifying thing I'm watching in this video? And to make such claims, again, genuine journalism, genuine historical research, well-informed commentary involves looking at context. If you're helping to seek people understand a situation, that is what you're supposed to do. However, if you just want to whip up hatred and contempt towards a group that you have hatred and contempt for, then you can do the kinds of things that many anti-Israel influencers are doing right now and what Tucker Carlson is doing right now. And so to make the claims against Israel in the context of the recent pogroms in Syria, you have to deliberately ignore the fact that Israel is the only country in the Middle East that legally guarantees religious freedom, as well as the only country where the Christian population has steadily grown from 34,000 in 1948 to 180,000 today. About 80% of these, by the way, are Arab Christians. In the rest of the Middle East, the Christian population has dropped from 13% a century ago to 5% today. Of course, we know why that is, but people seeing videos of Islamists butchering people want to find some way to blame the butchering, not on the Islamists, but on the Jews. That's what they want to do, because again, this is just a vile echo of an ancient blood libel. And Jew-hating social media influencers will make much of grantedly disgusting video clips of ultra-Orthodox Jews showing disdain for Christians in Jerusalem. But then they neglect to mention that the Israeli government makes Jerusalem, the holy sites, the whole country safe for more than 1.5 million Christians to visit every single year. Every single year. Israel, to put it very, very bluntly, is the only truly safe place for Christians in the entire Middle East. Now, I know that Christians have frequently borne the brunt of Middle Eastern conflicts and the broader geopolitical situation, and they often fare better under brutal strongmen such as Bashar al-Assad, who was just forced out as the president of Syria, or even Saddam Hussein as president of Iraq. They often fare better under them than they do under Islamist leaders. And in fact, I wrote a column all the way back in 2017 detailing concerns that the overthrow of the House of Assad could actually be bad for Christians on the ground. The ever-shifting situation in the Middle East is very volatile, and I think no nation understands that better than Israel, which is a tiny Jewish minority surrounded by Muslim nations. But those who are seeking to portray Israel as a persecutor of Christians rather than those doing the persecuting are frankly doing something else altogether. Indeed, Father Benedict Keeley, who is the only Catholic priest in the English-speaking world who works full-time to support persecuted Christians around the world, has noted that Jewish leaders are incredibly supportive of his work. Cardinal Dolan of New York once told him that the greatest support he had received when facing off the ISIS persecution of Christians was from Jewish leaders. That has been ignored too by all those who wish to notice the facts that feed their anti-Semitism, and the Jew hatred that is swamping the online conversation surrounding Christian persecution right now is disgusting. I remember when the ISIS persecution of Christians was playing out, I interviewed Lord George Weidenfeld, a very famous publisher, had a long-standing friendship with Pope John Paul II, and he began to spend an enormous amount of money to rescue Christians who were being persecuted by ISIS because he was grateful for the fact that his life had been saved from the Holocaust by Christians. And I interviewed him about this story at the time. He's now passed away. I also interviewed somebody that they started to refer to as the Jewish Schindler, a Canadian businessman named Steve Maman, who set up a big organization to free Yazidis and Christians who had been taken captive by ISIS. Those are stories that we can do, we can tell as well. We can notice those stories, but those stories, of course, are never noticed. And I think there's something borderline sacrilegious about cynically using the persecution of Christians as a political plaything this way. To be clear, many influencers are just doing great, good faith work, trying to raise awareness about the persecution of Christians, urge Christians to be praying for their persecuted brothers and sisters. But there are more than a few others who see videos of families being bullied or butchered and assume immediately that the leaders or people or entire groups that they already hate and hold in contempt must bear some responsibility. And they immediately set to work to place the blame where their bigotry already rests. I want to emphasize, no nation or government, of course, should be free of criticism, and certainly not those engaged in war, which both Ukraine and Israel obviously are. But in far too many cases, this is not what we are seeing. We are not seeing good faith criticism, and I think it's shameful. I really do think it's shameful. And if people like Tucker Carlson were capable of shame, I would hope that they would feel that when they look honestly at what they're doing right now. Because for many on the left, the persecution of Christians has been inconvenient for a very long time, inconvenient to the narratives they want to push, inconvenient to their oppression hierarchies. But now for many on the right, the persecution of Christians has become convenient because it allows them to accuse those they hate of somehow being responsible for the persecution of Christians. And I think that persecuted Christians deserve better than to serve as evidence for the preferred political narratives, especially when those narratives are designed to encourage hatred. President Donald Trump has endorsed liberal leader Mark Carney. Most of you probably heard this already, but what's interesting is that there's now a lot of progressives that are really panicked by this, who are claiming that Donald Trump is pulling the old reverse endorsement. There's guys like Stephen Mayer and stuff like that. This is what they're claiming, that obviously Donald Trump endorsed Mark Carney because he wants to hurt Mark Carney because he actually supports Pierre Poilievre. I think that the way Trump instinctually responds to things, I thought we all moved past the 3D chess thing, that's not actually what's going on. And so let's take a look at the video in which he endorses Mark Carney, and let's discuss what it actually means and why he actually did it.
We have a very big deficit with Canada, and there's no reason, much more, we have much more. Just so you understand, we subsidize Canada, and I like Canada. I love Canada. I love Wayne
now
Gretzky.
The Liberal guys,
I love his wife.
The Liberal Party is going to win now in the next election, most
care.
likely. And they were down and out. But isn't that going to make them more hostile to us and possibly
I'd
open
rather
the
deal
door
with a liberal than a
for
conservative.
China closer to Canada, and that would really put us in a bind.
The conservative that's running is stupidly no friend of mine. I don't know him, but he said negative things. So when he says negative things, I couldn't care less. I think it's easier to deal, actually, with a liberal. And maybe they're going to win, but I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me at all.
So your end game is what with them?
My end game is I don't want to have a big deficit.
So, as you can see, the context for this interview is Laura Ingraham, who is a conservative commentator, is pushing Donald Trump on the reverse effect that all of his tariff nonsense has actually been creating, which is that in January, Pierre Poilievre was almost 26 points ahead. The Conservative Party was ready for its probably largest majority since the early 90s, and it was going to be a blowout. Now, like, polls obviously are notoriously subject to false boosts and things like that. But at a very minimum, the Liberals have a fighting chance again. And Mark Carney very well could win at least a minority government, maybe even more than that, we'll see. And she's saying this is a very bad thing. And Trump gets defensive because Trump cannot ever admit when he is wrong, ever. And so what does he do? He does the childish thing he does. Well, I don't actually really care at all. I don't care if Pierre loses. And then he pivots to criticizing Pierre for criticizing him. And you have to understand this about Donald Trump. This is not a reverse endorsement. So one, he's kind of backed into defending what he's been doing when a fellow conservative points out that it's not actually having the kind of effect that a conservative in the United States should want. But second of all, Donald Trump doesn't really care when lefties attack him. He kind of almost enjoys it, which is why he spends so much of his time deliberately triggering them and inflaming them. He really hates it, however, and he gets really thin-skinned when a conservative criticizes him. He cannot stand it when a Republican goes after him. It's why he was far more vicious about John McCain or Mitt Romney than he ever was against many of his left-wing allies, because he thinks he owns the Republican Party, and he does at this point. He's kind of redefined what the Republican Party looks like. And so it bothers him far more when conservatives don't bend the knee and kiss the ring. And so no doubt Pierre Poilievre's statements condemning Trump's tariff war, his totally unprovoked trade war against Canada, no doubt that makes him really, really irritated. And Trump being Trump, he doesn't think, he has zero empathy, so he can't think why a conservative leader running for prime minister in a country that he constantly jokes about annexing might have some pretty harsh words about said jokes about annexing. And so that's why he ends up saying, no, I actually think the Liberals would be easier to deal with. And not only does Trump believe that, I very much suspect that that's true. And I did laugh when this clip came out because I thought, like, Pierre Poilievre right now is in his office laughing hysterically. Like, this is the best thing that's ever happened to him, because Carney and the Liberals' entire campaign was like, Pierre Poilievre is Trump. And during the Liberal leadership race, I believe we aired that clip on the Bridgehead briefing earlier. Mark Carney actually said, Pierre Poilievre worships the man. And now Pierre can just respond like, do you mean the man who endorsed you to be next Prime Minister of Canada? Because he said he'd rather deal with you than with me. So at very minimum, it gives Pierre Poilievre the perfect shut up argument. And like 5 minutes after the clip came out, Pierre Poilievre wrote this on X. Last night, President Donald Trump endorsed Mark Carney. New paragraph. Why? Because as Trump said, he's easier to deal with and knows that I will be a tough negotiator and always put Canada first. Carney is weak and would cave to Trump's demands, just like he did when he moved his company headquarters from Canada to New York City. Canadians don't want a weak and conflicted leader. They want a strong prime minister who will put Canada first. We'll see what Canadians want. They haven't been particularly impressive the last couple of election cycles, as some of you might have noticed, and the instability in the polls indicates that, as Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government except all others that have been tried. And so unfortunately, we could very easily end up with another Liberal tenure. But this definitely does change a lot of things. But it's also a reminder to conservatives who are a fan of President Donald Trump, perhaps because of the genuine magnitude and scale of his political achievement, him coming back and winning the presidency, winning the popular vote, winning both houses. What he pulled off is really unbelievable. At the same time, he's fundamentally unstable in terms of how he does business. The tariffs have been whiplashing back and forth. Most of Trump's team doesn't even know what he's going to do tomorrow or the next day. He responds to situations in real time, and this puts a massive damper on our ability to actually have a trading relationship that's reliable, that people can invest in, that people can count on, that they can build their businesses around. And it's the same thing here. I don't think that Donald Trump headed into the interview prepared to endorse Mark Carney, but fortunately for Mark Carney, he got his first really big endorsement, and It's from the president of our largest trading partner, which I'm sure he's excited about. There are a few, and this is funny, there are actually a few liberals who are like, this is foreign interference. And that is so hilarious because, as some of you might remember, and if you don't, I'm here to remind you, when Justin Trudeau's campaign was really flagging, after remember all of the blackface photos came out and not even Trudeau knew how many were going to come out? Because they're like, how many times have you used blackface, Mr. Trudeau? I was like, I can't really remember. And they're like, he was really young. I'm like, he was 30. Like, he was 30 years old, the last documented instance we have of him using blackface. So this was happening like all the time, to the point where he's like, yeah, no, I really couldn't say. I really couldn't say how many times I did that. And according to the insider accounts of the campaign, which have already been published by some of his major biographers, he really lost his mojo on the campaign trail at the time until his team reached out to Barack Obama's team and he procured an endorsement from President Barack Obama. And he's like, oh, the black president endorsed me. I have been a black politician for some of the time myself, so I really feel like we have a connection, and now I'm back into it. And then he got Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, to also endorse him. And so this was foreign interference. Like, I don't really care about that, but if you're going to talk about foreign interference, actively soliciting the endorsement of an African-American president to get you out of a scandal where you put blackface on like every 5 minutes, all the way up till the age of 30 when you were a grown person who presumably should know better. Everybody did dumb stuff when they were teenagers. When you're 30, it's kind of like, son, it's time to grow up. You know, we're going to have a chat about all the makeup that you wear all the time. But no, he got Barack Obama's endorsement. Now the liberals are like, Donald Trump endorsing Mark Carney is foreign interference. All right, well, maybe Mark Carney, if he cared so much about foreign interference, wouldn't have chosen Mark Mendicino for his acting chief of staff, considering how well Mendicino handled that file. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can Google that one. But anyways, I think it's super nice. Donald Trump has endorsed Mark Carney. He'd rather deal with a liberal. It's now foreign interference, but it wasn't when Trudeau's team solicited Barack Obama's endorsement. And so that's the crackling bonfire of the hypocrisies going on with the liberal election, which we're all going to enjoy very much. Canada's progressive press is insisting that the story of Mark Carney's trans activist daughter is both off limits and unimportant at the same time. And I do think that this is worth addressing. In a previous episode of The Briefing, I explained what the political implications of that story were, why the story is actually politically relevant, because of course, the gender ideology is being debated right now, right across the country. And now we have a prime minister whose views are at bare minimum going to be informed by his daughter's views, or as Barbara Kay put it on X, even if Mark Carney disagrees with her in his heart of hearts, he's not going to take any opposing position just to keep family peace, which is, again, totally understandable. But to claim that the story has no political implications at all is frankly just wrong. And one of the reasons so many journalists are claiming this is because they don't think gender ideology is a big deal. So they don't think that kids transitioning is a big deal. They don't think the idea of a third gender on Canadian documents is a big deal. And so if you don't think gender ideology is a big deal, then you can write off the story of the Prime Minister's trans activist daughter as no big deal. But that's premised on whether or not you think this is a really important issue, which millions of Canadians do, and obviously the Premier of Alberta does as well. But I want to defend why I think this story was worthy of coverage, in particular from even more than just the political side of things. And so one of the things I asked Robin Urbach of the Globe and Mail online was if Pierre Poilievre had an adult child. So keep in mind, Sasha Carney is 24 years old. And there's all of these journalists and these liberal commentators on X and elsewhere saying you can't bully a child. She is 24 years old. Younger than when Justin Trudeau was wearing blackface, but still 24 years old, pretty up there. She graduated from Yale University, and she is also a writer. Now, what do writers do? It might help for the journalists making this claim to reflect on what it is that writers do. They communicate things to the public for the purposes of public consumption because they want people to read the words that they write. And so the reason we know Sasha Carney did therapy at Tavistock Clinic in London, not as some ex-commentators are falsely claiming, she did not undergo transition, or if she did, there's no evidence for that. But the reason we know she went to Tavistock Clinic is because she wrote this in an essay for a magazine that she wanted people to read. So the idea that commenting on what she has publicly written, the idea that that's off limits is very strange. It's very bizarre. Because when I'm writing about gender ideology or politics or any of the issues that I write about very regularly, you're trying to add your voice to a public conversation about those issues, and you fully expect people to interact with you on the subject that you're writing about. And Sasha Carney bills herself as a writer. She is described in bios for many different publications as a writer based in Brooklyn. She's also an editor. Just to read one of the descriptions that's online, I spent a while kind of going through some of her other public writing. She's described as a writer and editorial assistant from Ottawa, based in Brooklyn, a 2-time recipient of the Foyle Young Poets of the Year Award, had poetry longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize in 2019, and has published fiction, nonfiction, and poetry in the Yale Literary Magazine, The Forge, Barron Magazine, and others. I spent a few hours this week kind of reading through a lot of her published work. And Carney, again, isn't just some kid who struggled with gender dysphoria. She is an adult who bills herself as a trans activist. So, for example, in a story covered by the Yale Daily News, she was actually at a trans vigil, and she was complaining about the fact that there were very few sort of straight cisgender people present. There was just LGBT identifying people. And here's what she said, quote, "I think now more than ever, when transgender rights are being tangibly threatened by the Trump administration, when people's access to healthcare, hormone therapy, name changes, and legal gender recognition, all of these are political hot-button issues, face a threat of all being swept away, it is more important than ever to force people to realize that this is something which impacts the communities all around them." This was a public speech covered by the Yale Daily News, to which she gave quotes so that people could read her opinion on issues of current political importance. This is really important stuff. The idea that we can't interact with her public writing when she's inserting her voice into the conversation surrounding gender ideology, but that we're not allowed to read that, somehow off limits to engage with her public work, is genuinely stupid. It really is. And back to my previous point, like, if Pierre Poilievre had a 24-year-old kid, a 24-year-old son or daughter, who was a pro-life activist, for example, do you think the journalists would leave it alone? Do you think say that's off limits? Or would they say he is an adult, he is an advocate for a position that's debated here in Canada, and his position sheds light on his father's position? Would that not be news? Of course it would be news. Or let's say Pierre Poilievre's kid was Billboard Chris, or an anti-gender ideology activist who was doing exactly what Sasha Carney is doing, but from the opposite perspective. If Pierre Poilievre had a journalist kid living in New York, constantly talking about the dangers of gender ideology, would that be considered a story? There is no doubt that would be considered a major story. And so when Robin Urbach of the Globe and Mail says this is a trash story with zero public interest, she's actually describing her own opinion of the gender ideology debate in general more than anything else. She says it's a terribly weak way to defend publishing a story that cruelly targets a politician's kid just to whip up fury. Well, there are people cruelly targeting all kinds of people on X. But that's not what the Juno News story did. And Candace Malcolm's analysis of the story was very sympathetic. So yes, she's publishing the information that Sasha Carney published first, I might point out. It's the only reason we know about it. But again, she's not going over and giving a noogie to a 5-year-old or publishing private, intimate details of, a 12-year-old's hospital records or something. They're engaging with the written public record as published publicly by somebody who is an aspiring writer, which means they want people to read their stuff. So or are we supposed to read it and we're not allowed to express our opinion on it because she's the daughter of the prime minister of the country? All right. That does speak to what their journalistic standard is, but pretty weird. It is pretty weird. Again, if the roles were reversed, I think that it would be completely different. Let me give you another example of why I think Carney's work is actually interesting. So I went through a couple of even her major essays, and she wrote an essay back in 2022 called Formed This Way for another publication based, again, at Yale University, one of the top Ivy League schools. And she details her views on transgenderism in very stark terms and basically makes the case for gender fluidity. So she says this, The belief in an innate gender is an understandable defense against a homophobic and transphobic world. I thought it was science, but fair. Lady Gaga sang Born This Way to a pre-Obergefell v. Hodges America. After all, queers are prickly in the face of conversion therapy logic, which is correctly perceived as the attempts of dominant society to nudge aberrant desires towards more palatable ones. If we as trans people did not choose our strangeness, if it is instead a naturalized cradle-to-grave form of human difference, then it follows that it can be tolerated in the name of equality, maybe even in extraordinary circumstances embraced. So she then attacks the idea that trans-identifying children are somehow being victimized and dismisses Abigail Schreier's landmark book, Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, as basically fear-mongering, although she writes that, quote, it is an anti-trans text that I never have read and never will. And quite frankly, her essay really does reveal that she hasn't read it, because she's engaging with what she wants Abigail Schreier to have written, not what Abigail Schreier actually wrote. But then Sasha Carney writes this, again, public essay, all you gotta do is plug her name into Google and it pops up. Gender is inherently a process of social relation. Who you are as a woman or a man or otherwise forms in relation to the gendering of those around you. A cisgender man in a locker room may feel socially compelled towards certain motions, phrases, or stories. She's obviously never been in a male locker room. We just change and get out of there. And to affirm and solidify their own manhood in the world. No, we're just basically trying to get our pants on and leave. What is so natural about that? Ask yourself now, do your friends perform or do gender? Your mother, your father, your partner? Is the performance of cisgender heterosexual manhood, for instance, any less determined by who you are friends with, the insecurities you have around your body, or your desire to amass social capital? Brazilian waxes and pre-workout smoothies alike are gender-affirming processes. Shaving your face and wearing a dress can be too. So this is all very Judith Butler-esque queer studies gobbledygook, and a lot of it's actually internally contradictory, because if we merely do gender, then why do we need surgeries and hormone therapy to make sure that the feelings you have on the inside, which, as she points out, are ever evolving, match the body you have on the outside? I think that the description she just gave of gender fluidity here directly contradicts the need for the very treatments that she's defending elsewhere in her work. And indeed, many of the arguments that I think Schreier lays out really chillingly, they kind of are enhanced by Carney's central argument. And in all likelihood, because Carney hasn't actually read Schreier's book, there's no engagement with the key premises of those who are warning about the long-term harms of gender-affirming care, such as the fact that somebody going on puberty blockers and then getting top and bottom surgery will essentially be rendered infertile and unable to experience sexual intimacy before they are old enough to vote, drink, or drive. That is the question at hand here, not dealt with at all. Now, I want to emphasize it's entirely possible that Prime Minister Mark Carney doesn't share some or even all of these views. But to claim that the public writing and activism of Sasha Carney has no bearing on how her father, the Prime Minister of Canada, will approach these issues, even if, as Barbara Kay observed, he's merely doing so for the sake of his daughter, is totally implausible. As Barbara Kay wrote, we can forget about Mark Carney engaging with the subject in any substantive way, whatever his innermost beliefs are. He will toe the party line in the interest of family peace. And she's completely right about that, unfortunately. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. Once again, drop any comments or suggestions in the comment section. Join the conversation that way. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Share it around if you thought the content was useful. That obviously helps us get the news about the show out. And you can listen to our content or download it wherever you get your content.